Let's check. Maybe I'm descended from presidents. Michael smirked, raising his glass. That evening was far too ordinary to end in catastrophe. Saturday. Warm light in the kitchen, a half-empty bottle of wine, a phone on the table. Soft music. From the child's room came the steady breathing of the 5-year-old boy. Michael considered the greatest miracle of his life. His wife smiled, tired but calm. The house was filled with that rare silence that comes only when you think all the worst things are finally behind you. Those are exactly the moments fate likes to strike. Michael ordered the DNA test as a joke, out of curiosity, for content. He thought it would be funny to find out whether there were kings or famous adventurers somewhere in his bloodline. He laughed while filling out the form, while sealing the envelope, while dropping it into the mailbox. He had no idea that in that moment he was pressing a button that would split his life into 2 parts, before and after. The result came 3 weeks later. He opened the email in the morning, not fully awake yet, a mug of coffee in his hand. His eyes skimmed over the lines automatically. Then his gaze froze. His shoulders tightened. The coffee suddenly tasted bitter, like blood. Probability of paternity, 0%. He read it once, then a second time. Then he zoomed in, as if the numbers might change if he stared at them long enough. 0%, not 1, not 5, not a margin of error, not a lab mistake. 0. At first he thought it had to be a technical error. Then a second thought rose slowly inside him. Betrayal. A third followed almost immediately. The end of the marriage, the end of trust, the end of the family he had believed was real. All day he walked around the house like a man who had suddenly forgotten how to understand the language people were speaking to him in. His wife asked him something. His son laughed while building a tower out of blocks. Outside, the city sounded exactly the same as always. But Michael could already feel reality starting to crack. He did not make a scene. He ordered a second test. When the second result came, he opened it in the car, parked outside a supermarket. It said the same thing. Probability of paternity, 0%. He sat behind the wheel, without starting the engine. The world around him looked the same, but inside, everything had already collapsed. Images flashed through his mind. The wedding, the hospital, the baby's first cry, that tiny hand wrapping around his finger, sleepless nights, a first step, a first daddy. And suddenly, all those memories felt as if someone had tried to cross them out with a single number. 0%. But the real horror began later. He insisted on expanded testing, maternal line verification, additional markers. It did not disprove anything. The boy had no genetic relationship to his mother either. This was not their child. When Michael read that, it felt as if the walls of the room had shifted. He sank to the floor in his office, unable to feel his legs. This was no longer about betrayal, no longer about lies between husband and wife. This was worse. It meant that 5 years earlier, someone had taken their son and given them someone else's. For a long time, he did not know what he was supposed to feel. Shock came first, then guilt. Because in the next room slept the boy he loved more than his own life. And now one word, stranger, kept trying to force its way into his mind like a blade. Michael came to hate that word. That child was not a stranger to him. He was the one Michael had taught to walk, the one he tucked in at night, the one who came running to him with scraped knees, the one who whispered before falling asleep, "Dad, don't go." Love does not disappear because of a test, but the truth can tear your heart open even when the love is still there. That night, he and his wife went through hell. First denial, then shouting, then tears, then silence. His wife sat in the kitchen, hugging herself, whispering. I held him. I remember. I saw him. I fed him. I couldn't have missed it. She was breaking under the thought that the real child she had carried under her heart had cried somewhere else, or perhaps had already grown up in another home, calling another woman mom. A few days later, Michael found a match in the DNA database. A woman named Sarah. Same city, same birth date, same clinic. And one sentence hit him harder than any punch ever could. She had been told her baby died during childbirth. They met in a small cafe on the outskirts of town. Sarah sat there gripping her cup as if it were the last object in the world that had not betrayed her. Her face was pale, her eyes red but dry. She had cried everything out years ago, when they told her son's heart had stopped. Michael showed her a photo of the boy. Her fingers started trembling. "That's him," she whispered. There was no logic in that sentence, only the voice of a mother who had not seen her child in 5 years and still recognized him before any laboratory did. The tests confirmed it. Their children had been switched at the hospital. The story spilled beyond the family. First lawyers, then police, then journalists. The news reached local media, then regional outlets. People were outraged. They argued. They cried in front of their screens. But while the country was only beginning to whisper about it, Michael had already started feeling someone's eyes on him. The first call came late at night. The number was hidden. He answered thinking it was a journalist. The male voice sounded calm, almost polite. "Stop, Michael. Don't dig any deeper." "Who is this?" "A man who knows you have a son you love very much." The line went dead. 2 days later, someone tried to force his car into a barrier on the highway. A black SUV came up on his left, cut him off, pinned him, then slammed into the side of his car. Michael barely kept control of the wheel. Tires screamed. The car skidded. At the last second, he managed to straighten it out. The SUV vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. An accident, any other person would have said, if they had not heard that phone call. But Michael already knew it was not an accident. He hired a private investigator, a former detective, quiet, methodical. The man promised nothing. A week later, he brought Michael the first file. 5 years earlier, a temporary shift had been working at the hospital where both Sarah and Michael's wife had given birth. 2 doctors resigned immediately after an internal review. One later died in an accident. A nurse emigrated suddenly. In the archives, there were 3 more similar cases. Babies from poor families who died, files closed, bodies cremated without independent examination. Meanwhile, children from wealthier families disappeared from the system as cleanly as if they had never existed at all. This had not been a mistake. It had been a system. The monster was not one person. It was a network. Children were being sold like merchandise. Some people wanted healthy newborns. Some wanted perfect paperwork. Some wanted money. And to that system, mothers were just bodies to deceive. Michael started shaking. Someone had sold his son and sold him someone else's child. He met Sarah again. "We need to go to the federal authorities," he said. She nodded, but there was fear in her eyes. A week later, the private investigator disappeared. No warning, no note, no trace. Michael went to his office. Empty. Phone disconnected. Computers gone. The door lock changed. At that point, everything became clear. He was not dealing with one doctor or one clinic. He was dealing with a machine, a network, the kind of evil that wears a tie and sells newborns, as if they were inventory. Michael started gathering evidence himself. He barely slept anymore. Night after night he went through old records, archives, payment transfers, files from dissolved foundations. His wife begged him to stop. She cried in the kitchen. saying she was afraid for him, for herself, for the boy. And the worst part was, maybe she was right. In one of the files he found a middleman company registered as a surrogacy agency. On paper, it all looked legal, but if you looked deeper, all the lines converged at one point. It was not an agency, it was a black market for newborns. One evening someone tried to break into his house. The alarm went off. Footsteps vanished outside. There were tool marks on the back door. His wife collapsed on the floor in the hallway. "Enough," she sobbed. "Please, we need to forget all of this. We could lose him, for good." That was the moment Michael truly broke, not from fear for himself, but because of that sentence. We could lose him for good, because suddenly he understood. This whole time, he had not just been fighting for the truth. He had been fighting against the horror of having to choose, against the thought that one day someone might demand they decide whose child belonged to whom, who should be returned, who should stay. He walked into the child's room. The boy was asleep, clutching a worn stuffed bear. His face looked peaceful, trusting. Michael sat beside him and cried in silence so he would not wake him, because it did not matter whose blood ran through that child's veins. For 5 years that boy had called him Dad, and that word had already sunk into his bones. He gave the evidence to an investigative journalist, a woman with a hard voice and a reputation for taking cases all the way to the end. She said only one thing: if this is true, very big people are going to fall. A month later, the first report came out, then a second, then a third. The scandal became national. Federal investigation, arrests, raids. The hospital shut down. Officials interrogated. Mothers who had believed their children were dead began filing statements one after another. But the mastermind disappeared. And then just when Michael thought the worst might finally be behind him, a letter arrived. No return address. Inside was a single sentence: "You are not raising that child by accident." His hands went cold. He decided to do one more test, a deep one. Rare genetic markers, mutations. The result was almost absurd. The boy had an extremely rare genetic mutation, the same one Michael had. So rare that the chance of a random match was almost non-existent. He started digging into his own past. Old adoption records, birth certificates, documents, inconsistencies, gaps, signatures from people long dead. And then the truth hit him so hard that everything before it seemed like nothing but a prologue. The architect of the entire scheme was his own biological father. The man who had abandoned him as a child. The man who had built an underground network for selling newborns. Michael had been one of the first switched children 25 years earlier. He himself had been a stolen child. He sat over those documents until dawn, feeling the world disappear beneath him for the second time in his life. Everything he believed about his past turned out to be a set. Everything he had called coincidence had been part of the system. And the boy he had been raising had not ended up in his family by chance. Someone had closed the circle. The twisted logic of a criminal, returning a stolen son into the bloodline of a stolen father. In that moment, Michael stopped being afraid. Fear ended where fury began. This was no longer just personal pain. It was war against the man who had stolen his childhood, then tried to steal his fatherhood, and on top of that had played with human lives as if he were a god. His father was arrested a year later in another country, under a false name, with new papers. The trial dragged on. In the courtroom, mothers told stories of spending years mourning children who had been alive all along. Adults told stories of suddenly learning that their names, their blood, their families were not who they had believed them to be. When they brought his father into the courtroom, Michael saw for the first time the face of the man who had shattered generations. He expected a demon. He saw an old man, calm, gray-haired, almost respectable. And that made it even worse, because the most monstrous evil rarely looks monstrous. It looks decent. But the hardest part was not the trial. The hardest part was talking to the boy. One evening, the child sat on the bed, knees hugged to his chest, and asked softly, "Dad, are we a real family?" At that moment, Michael's voice shook more than it ever had in court. He sat beside him, looked at him for a long time, and said, "A real family is not only blood. A real family is the people who do not leave, the people who look for you, the people who fight for you, the people who stay beside you even when the whole world is falling apart." The boy was silent. "And you'll stay," he whispered. Michael held him so tightly it was as if he were trying to protect him from the past, from the trial, from lies, from every adult who had once betrayed children for money. Always, and only then, for the first time in all that time, did he understand one terrible and at the same time saving truth. Yes, it all began as a stupid joke, with a glass of wine, with foolish laughter, with a DNA test ordered for fun. But it did not end with a family being destroyed. It ended with a criminal empire being exposed. It ended with a lie built on other people's tears finally beginning to burn. The laughter truly ended forever. But with it, impunity ended too.